frames or synths.
In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at a brand new effects pedal from the wizards over at Old Blood Noise Endeavours. OBNE make a whole host of weird and wonderful effects pedals, including one called Screen Violence, which I did a video on just a few weeks ago. So if you haven't already watched that, then perhaps it's worth looking up after you've watched this one. However, today I'm going to be taking a particular look at Float. Float is a dual filter pedal which has got LFO controls in there and also some other interesting additions that I'm going to come on to talk about in a wee bit. Now, the concept of this pedal at its heart is fairly straightforward. However, the nature of its implementation means that there are quite a lot of hidden depths in there. So whilst I'm going to do my best to explain the individual features and give you an overview of what you can do with it with some examples, then this is something that you'll still be able to get quite a lot out of with your own experimentation if you decide to get one. Now, before I go on to talk about any of the particular features or functionality of the pedal itself, I do have to give a particular shout out or mention to the artwork, not just of the pedal, but also of the box, because I think that if you're going to be spending money on something like a boutique effects pedal, you want the whole experience to be a special one, and this really was, because when it turned up in the envelope and opened it up, I was confronted with this beautifully colourful box, and I have to say that it reminded me of the old kind of loud shirts you used to get from Mambo in Australia, if anybody knows what I'm talking about. But either way, I liked it a lot. And then of course I opened it up and was confronted with the pedal, which is equally beautiful, but also which has a design which makes a lot of sense in terms of the functionality, because the design is actually quite clever in the sense that it gives you an idea or a hint at what the function or what the purpose or concept or idea behind the pedal actually is. Now, if you look at the front, you'll see we've got these two heads here, which are kind of Pac-Man looking things. To me, it's got very much 1984 kind of Nick Cage face-off dystopian vibes, which I am very much into. But the idea is that it mirrors each other, and so if you look at the left side, you'll see that every control you've got in there is mirrored on the right side. So whoever came up with the design and the packaging of this pedal, you have my respect. I really genuinely love it. So this is Float, and as you can see from the front here, there are a whole bunch of different parameters available to us. And when I first saw an image of this from Old Blood Noise Endeavours, I did wonder what kind of size it was going to be when it turned up, given the amount of controls that are on there. However, I was pleasantly surprised to discover that it's actually fairly compact. It's a nice wee size, and it also doesn't feel too cramped when you're operating it, partly because of the rather clever decision to use these faders for one of the parameters. So kudos to Old Blood Noise Endeavours for managing to pull that off. Your mileage may vary, of course, if you've got giant stubby sausage fingers. However, I have nice slender, agile, graceful hands, and so this is not a problem for me at all. Now, when it comes to the actual functionality, as I mentioned, each side mirrors the other one. So if you know what one side does, you know what the other side does. So I don't need to tell you each individual knob or anything. I can just tell you one side and you can figure out the other one, hopefully. Otherwise, something is very, very wrong with you. Basically, each side or each effect is made up of a filter and also an LFO. Now, the filter can be one of three types, which is selectable using this wee switch here. We have low pass, band pass, and high pass, which is pretty nice. You can control the resonance using this potentiometer, and also this fader that I mentioned allows you to control the cutoff frequency of the filter. For the LFO, we can control the rate of the LFO here, or the speed of the LFO. When it is all the way at 0, the LFO is off, and this works just as a kind of standard filter which isn't modulated by the LFO. But when the rate is engaged and the LFO is active, then we have a bunch of different shapes here which we can select from. And since I am too far away and my eyesight is too bad in order to be able to read these wee symbols at the moment, I'm going to read the types off of my notes, and that is sine, triangle, square, ramp, reverse ramp, and random. So you do have quite a lot of different LFO shapes available as well, which is really quite nice indeed. As one might expect, there is a volume control for each individual effect, and we have a switch for each, which is the soft touch type of switch, I believe, which allows you to engage or disengage each individual side. Now, for some of the kind of common buttons or switches or whatever that we've got down here, we can either run each individual filter or each individual effect separately in free roaming, as it were, or we can sync the two of them together. And you do so using this wee micro mini switch thing here. Now, when the two of them are synced together, then filter 1 will effectively be the master, and filter 2 will follow filter 1. So the rate knob on filter 2 will then become a subdivision, or a division, I guess, of the rate knob on filter 1, if that makes sense, because otherwise they wouldn't be synced, obviously. Now, this wee toggle switch down here is a momentary toggle switch, and what this does is let you set a range of values for both the rate or the frequency cutoff point, so that you can get more finer grain control over the kind of sound. And the way it works is, in order to set the maximum, you leave it where it is and you adjust the relevant control. But if you want to set a minimum value, you hold it over. It is momentary, so you have to hold it in place. You set the rate or your cutoff point, and that's it, set and done, which is quite smart, really. Now, the most difficult part of this whole pedal to explain, and the bit that took me far longer to wrap my own head around than I am willing to admit, is the sensitivity function. Now, as far as I understand it, what this does is allow you to control the intensity and direction of an envelope. And the envelope will either impact the LFO rate if you have your LFO active, or if the LFO is inactive, as in if the rate is set to 0, then the envelope will affect the cutoff frequency, right? Simple. Now, when this knob is set to noon, that means the envelope is inactive, so it won't have an impact on either the cutoff frequency or the rate. However, if you set it to a positive value, as in above noon, the envelope will start at the minimum rate or cutoff frequency and then move up towards the maximum rate or cutoff frequency. However, if you go below noon, so if you move down the way into a negative value, the envelope will start at the maximum and then come down the way. And this will differ depending on the strength of your input signal, which makes a lot of sense with guitar, but it would also make sense if you've got a velocity sensitive synthesizer or a drum machine or something like that. And hopefully that makes sense, because that is more difficult to explain than I anticipated. Now, there is an added complication here in the sense that if you have both of these synced together, then the filter envelope of filter number 2 will no longer be independent, and so the setting of the sensitivity knob will be slightly different. For example, if you set it above noon, then it will follow filter number 1's envelope exactly, and if you go below noon, then it will be the inverse of that. Now for me, one of the coolest things about this pedal is the different routing possibilities that there are, because on the rear here we have two pairs of jacks. We have two inputs and two outputs. They are on the standard kind of 1/4 inch jack. Now this means that you can either run it as a standard mono input where both of these effects run in parallel, so they're both applied to the signal and come out via a single mono output. But you can also run it in stereo, where you can have two separate channels running in and use these effectively as different effects that come out separate stereo channel outputs. But you can also run in a single mono input and then affect the signal differently with each individual effect, and then bring them out separately via these jacks so that you can process them differently. And I think that sounds really cool actually if you hard pan them and you get this kind of undulating sound, and that's what I've used in a few of my examples. If you're feeling saucy, you can also split these up and effectively use them as two entirely separate pedals and run one into the other. So for example, in order to do that, what you would do is plug in a mono input into input 1. You would then take a patch cable from output number 1, put it into input number 2, and that will run the affected signal back through into this filter here, and then you get the final filtered signal coming out of output 2, which is really quite cool indeed. The final thing that I think is worth mentioning about this pedal is that there is an expression jack input on the side, and if you use a TRS input, this means that you can control either the cutoff frequency or the LFO rate for each individual side. And in order to do that, you hold down the two foot switches at the same time, and after a few seconds they will dance like so, and then you move the individual parameter that you want to be able to control on each side. So let's say on filter 1 I want to control the cutoff frequency, so I'll move that, and on filter number 2 I want to control the LFO rate, and then I just hold down these foot switches again and it will save that setting like so. Nice. And what I'm going to do is experiment with some of my weird and wonderful CV input or output devices and see what kind of things I can come up with. So that is Float. I think it's a really interesting pedal, not least because, as I mentioned, it's got some of my favourite pedal artwork and design ever, but also because it brings together a bunch of interesting parameters and allows them to interact in a way that can be unpredictable and really quite pleasing. But who is this going to be for? Well, I think this would be ideal for somebody who is a sonic explorer, somebody that likes to experiment with different types of modulation, but particularly people that maybe don't want to go and sell off their firstborn in order to get a modular system in order to play about with that kind of thing. Here you get some of the beauty that you find in modular systems in terms of the interaction between LFOs and filters and everything in a fairly, or at least relatively affordable box. So if that sounds like you and you like to spice up your drones or your melodies or your atmospheric pads or whatever, then this might be something that you would be interested in looking into. You can find these on Old Blood Noise Endeavour's site. Big thanks to them again for sending me this to check out. I think it's cool as fuck. For now, I am going away. Goodbye.